Lecture 2, Identity, Status and Social Groups. Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you've been enjoying the course so far, and we are going to continue with our second lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to continue discussing the nature of human sociability, and in particular we are going to focus on the importance of seeking a social identity and social status, and the influence of social groups on the way people think and behave in social situations. In the lecture, I will try to emphasize the many ways in which social psychological research can be relevant in helping us to understand contemporary social issues, such as relationships between people and dealing with problems of diversity and social group conflict. First, we are going to say a few words about a very important aspect of human sociability, the apparently universal need for status and identity that characterizes all humans. This is understandable because throughout human history, human beings lived in small group, intimate, communal environments, and in those environments, having a status and a social identity was a natural consequence of group life. These needs are still with us today in the 21st century, but because now we live in a very different sort of society, status and identity needs often go unsatisfied. Essentially, communal small group life has disappeared in Western societies, in Western civilizations in the last 200 or 300 years only, since about the 18th century, when the philosophy of the Enlightenment and the idea of individualism have first taken hold as a basis of organizing society. This idea has resulted in a tremendous increase in freedom, wealth, health, and human well-being in general. But because small group life disappeared, human beings face a significant unfulfilled status and identity needs. As a result of that, in many modern post-industrial societies, loneliness and isolation are very serious problems, as the social psychologist Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University shown in a number of surveys. It is an interesting possibility to consider that unsatisfied status and identity needs might actually play an important role in driving materialism and consumerism in modern societies. If people can no longer derive a sense of status and identity in a small group, then possibly the purchase of goods and services might be an alternative way of achieving this. However, evidence suggests that status and identity needs cannot be fully satisfied as a result of consumption. Here is a couple of studies which show the lack of relationship between consumption and happiness. This paper by Diener and Seligman shows that if you chart the adjusted GDP in thousands per capita from the 1940s to 2000, and you also chart mean life satisfaction in the same period, what you find is that average GDP has gone up more than threefold. That's the steep ascending curve, and at the same time life satisfaction hasn't changed at all. We work harder, longer, we earn more money, and we spend more money, but we are not any happier. That's a very important point to remember. Here is another chart showing the same. It's looking at the relationship between satisfaction in life on a 0 to 10 scale in a number of different countries and the amount of income, average income of people in those countries. And what you'll see is a very interesting relationship. Up to about $10,000 per year per capita, there is some positive relationship between income, consumption, and happiness. Beyond $10,000, there is almost no improvement. Somebody earning $15,000 is almost as happy as somebody earning $40,000. In other words, wealth no longer increases life satisfaction and happiness. We are in some kind of a consumption trap. We're trying to serve our status and identity needs, and yet the more money we spend on trying to satisfy that need, it doesn't really produce the expected reward in increase in happiness. Some economists, for example Lord Layard in the United Kingdom, argued that one way to short-circuit this pointless pursuit of wealth is to raise income taxes to such a level that it would not be worth people to work more than a minimum amount of time. Lord Layard argues that if income tax was 99%, let's say, most of us would stop working at about $20,000 or $25,000 a year. That would get us all the necessities. And Lord Layard argues we would also become much happier, because instead of working and spending, we would spend more time with each other in communal activities, in relationships, which is ultimately what makes us happy. So it's possible that there is some kind of a crisis with consumption. One way that individuals can cope with this is to actually start to become more conscious of what they buy, why they buy it, and what's the point of all that consumption. Once you become aware of the fact that you are a Stone Age person who seeks status and identity, and you seek status and identity by the wrong means, by buying things, you might be able to change your behavior and ultimately might end up being a happier person. Advertising plays a very important role in generating and exploiting status and identity needs. If you look at most of the ads you see on TV or in magazines, they essentially appeal to status and identity features. If you look at that link, The History of Consumerism, it's a very interesting summary of how consumerism developed in industrial societies in the past few hundred years. As we have seen before, buying things in order to satisfy status and identity needs ultimately doesn't work. And as Lord Layard suggested, perhaps the way to improve our well-being is to reduce consumption and increase the amount of time available for social connections. There are many examples of advertising appealing to status and identity needs. There are many brands like Nike, Apple Computers, most cosmetics, health foods, vitamin supplements that really offer a sense of identity more than an actual utility product. The role of brands is very important. You can see that you can sell a perfume with a name like Mercedes-Benz, even though this is a car manufacturer. Burberry, who is actually a manufacturer of raincoats in the 19th century, now puts its name on expensive watches. And you can buy a perfume named after Beyoncé, even though Beyoncé obviously has nothing to do with the manufacturing of perfumes. In all of these cases, what you are paying for is a piece of identity, a sense of status that comes from purchasing this particular product. If you want to avoid this, probably the best advice is that as a consumer, you should avoid all brands and to avoid anything that's being advertised. And to be rational, you should try to decide only on price and quality in determining what you buy. There is plenty of evidence all around us for irrational consumer decisions. Look at some of those basic kitchen appliances. You can buy a perfectly good toaster in Kmart for $17, but if you want to pay 15 times as much, you can buy an almost identical toaster, which has SMEG written on it, for $249. You can buy a perfectly good electric kettle for $15, again in Kmart, but if you insist, you can go to Harvey Norman and get an identical kettle for 15, 16 times as much for $249. Or look at a microwave oven, again, Kmart, $48, a brand product is $398. In each of these cases, people choose to spend more money because to some extent, Instead of focusing on the utility of the item they want to buy, they are influenced by the identity associations that they make with the product. Bottled water is a typical identity product. A few decades ago, this market simply didn't exist. You could ask yourself, why should people buy a colorless, tasteless, transparent liquid that is actually freely available from every tap? Right now we have a situation that brands like Perrier, Evian, San Benedetto are being shipped to Australia in large quantities. What people buy is not so much the water, but the label and the name. Actually, it turns out that bottled water is much less healthy than tap water. About 40% of all bottled water turns out to be tap water. In blind tastings, when people are asked to compare the taste of different waters, tap water significantly gets the best results. People prefer tap water. So how did you establish a market for water? It really basically happened due to misleading advertising. Advertisers claim that tap water is unhealthy, which is actually not true, and bottled water is cool. There are some really bizarre claims. For example, if you look at the label below, active, organic, pure Australian water, that's completely nonsense. What is active water like, and how does it differ from non-active water? And water, of course, cannot be organic. Water is fundamentally an inorganic compound. So essentially, any claim, any label works as long as it satisfies some kind of a longing in the consumer to label themselves, to claim a particular status and identity. As we have seen, the tendency for human beings to seek status and identity in order to signal their belonging to a particular group is very powerful, and in the absence of meaningful communal groups, advertising and marketing can exploit this deeply felt human need for sociability. Human sociability is also deeply influenced by our membership in groups, the tendency to think, behave, and act in consensus with other group members. And we shall look at this aspect of human sociability next. The powerful influence of groups on human thinking and behavior has been dramatically illustrated in the experiments by Henri Tajfel, a British psychologist at the University of Bristol, who published a series of studies, the so-called minimal group experiments. These are experiments where the experimenter creates arbitrary, meaningless groups in terms of such transparently pointless divisions as one side of the lecture theatre is labeled Group A, the other side is Group B, or simply tossing a coin to decide who belongs to Group A or Group B. It's important to know that these groups are meaningless groups. They have no past, they have no future, people have no personal contact with each other, and they don't expect the group to continue into the future. When Tajfel then asks members of these arbitrary groups to make a simple decision, allocating rewards, it may be money or lottery tickets or movie tickets, to two individuals about whom they only know that one of them belongs to their own group and the other one belongs to the other group. In this kind of decision situation, Tajfel and many others since then documented a powerful and universal tendency for people to prefer their own group member to the other group, even though they don't know the person and the group is practically meaningless. In other words, given a chance, we tend to prefer our own group and will do whatever we can to put members of our own group into a better position than members of the other group. Tajfel suggests that one reason for this universal bias may be that this is one way that we can improve our social status and our identity. We all want to belong to high status groups, and so there is this spontaneous tendency to do whatever we can to improve the benefits flowing to our group as compared to the other group. In other words, it seems like groupishness, the tendency to prefer the in-group, is a universal evolutionary characteristic of human social nature. An implication of these findings is that whenever we divide people into groups, whenever we emphasize group differences, we're running a dangerous game because we know that human beings will automatically try to create differences between the in-group and the out-group in favor of the in-group. You might want to stop the presentation at this point to look at those two cartoons that give you a very nice summary of what social categorization is all about. Following Tajfel's innovative work, social identity theory became an important research field in social psychology, and a large number of studies have confirmed the finding that people seek positive distinctiveness by enhancing their in-group and they value the out-group. There are many examples of social identity effects in the real world. If you think about sports fans, religions, nationalities, occupations, ethnic groups, gender groups, they all have that tendency of promoting the in-group and often to the detriment of an out-group. Social identity processes have both cognitive and motivational underpinnings. The cognitive aspect of social identity theory refers to the fact that by classifying people into groups, we create social categorization which produces cognitive economy. It simply makes it easier to make sense of the social world. There's also an important motivational aspect. By seeking to belong to positively valued groups, we can promote our own self-esteem. This process of social identification can also be exploited in the search of status and significance. What these experiments show that human beings have an almost native inborn universal tendency to prefer in-groups to out-groups. At the extreme, we could almost say that we have a quasi-biological drive towards prejudice against out-groups. The implication of this research is a very important warning that there is a significant danger when we promote group identification. So this again is a brief summary of social identity theory, one of the most important theories that speaks to the question of how human beings relate to groups. Social identity theory suggests that people spontaneously categorize themselves into groups in order to classify the social world, to gain self-esteem, and to gain positive status. And this is more likely to happen when they experience insecurity or low self-esteem. And the most important message is that social identity seeking and group affiliation can very easily result in stereotyping, prejudice, and potentially intergroup conflict. Creating hatred towards outgroup members is extremely easy, and there are many examples of this happening in recent history. In one experiment, we found that people are more likely to think in a discriminatory way about outgroups when they think superficially rather than think analytically. In the 20th century, Nazis instigated group hatred towards Jews. The Soviet Union, as part of its communist ideology, identified large numbers of its own citizens as class enemies, and many of them were imprisoned and even exterminated. Currently, in China, a social credit system is used to identify enemies of the people, and millions of Uyghurs are actually locked up in camps in what has been described as a genocide. It happens even in our society. In many cultures, anti-vaxxers are treated as enemies of the people and are treated with the same hatred and disdain as any outgroup member has been treated in the past. Groups also have a very important influence on the way people shape and develop their beliefs about the world. Groups consider it necessary that members have a similar idea and a similar representation of reality. Consensus is often more important than the accurate perception of reality. The reason why humans are capable of doing that is that we do suffer from a number of important cognitive shortcomings. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a very important such example. The Dunning-Kruger effect refers to the tendency that people simply do not realize their own cognitive shortcomings and often believe themselves to be experts in areas that they really don't know anything about. Dunning and Kruger did a whole range of experiments showing that people who are fundamentally badly informed, misguided, or utterly unknowledgeable nevertheless have a great deal of confidence in their ability to correctly assess reality. Another cognitive shortcoming which helps group consensus to be maintained is the confirmation bias. Most people are inclined to confirm information that affirms their existing views and to reject information which they find threatening. If you look at the brief video on Donald Trump, it's an excellent example of the Dunning-Kruger effect and the confirmation bias. Trump is on record of claiming to be a world expert on almost anything. So just watch this video. Groups then maintain a coherent worldview by suppressing dissent, by stopping people from believing or voicing views that the group doesn't approve of. There is a lot of historical evidence indicating that human civilizations, human groups, sometimes over hundreds of years, had very bizarre, crazy beliefs about the world, and despite of lack of any evidence supporting these belief systems endured. In modern life, we see many examples of conspiracy theories and conspiracy beliefs. People believe all kinds of crazy ideas about conspiracies. In the United States, many people who believe in the QAnon conspiracy believe that the world is run by a secret group of pedophiles who basically want to take over power, and that this group is led by Hillary Clinton. This seems completely nonsensical, but if you happen to belong to that group and this is the information you are exposed to, then it's very easy to take this to be reality. When you look at group beliefs over time, you can see that there is many examples of collective delusions, essentially crazy belief systems that groups, cultures, or civilizations maintained over long periods of time. In Western Europe, people believed in witchcraft for a very long time. Many American cultures have practiced human sacrifice as part of their religious rituals. In Europe, religious wars between Catholics and Reformed churches lasted for many decades. Humans are quite capable of believing in utopistic ideologies, promising a better future at the cost of current sacrifice and suffering. Fascism and Marxism are good examples of such utopistic ideologies. Personality cults. Placing your faith and trust in a particular leader is also a recurring feature of human civilization. In the last 100 years, Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Castro are examples of such cults of personality. Even though group beliefs are often unreasonable and delusional, they can still serve the purpose of integrating a group and helping the group to establish a common sense of identity. The purpose of these shared beliefs is then largely to affirm the unique status and identity of a particular group. The tendency to engage in out-group discrimination is facilitated by groupthink. This is a topic we discussed in your first-year lectures. In Groupthink situations, as described by Irving Janis, a group senses an illusion of invulnerability, they are unanimous, they have collective rationalization, they believe in their inherent morality, they stereotype the outgroups, and come to create a completely incontrovertible and absolute belief in their own righteousness. It's this mental state that facilitates hatred and discrimination against outgroups. Groupthink often occurs in everyday life, and the use of online communications makes the likelihood of groupthink even stronger. Communicating on media sites like Twitter and Facebook makes it extremely easy for people to form a strong consensual opinion, criticize others who don't agree with them, pile on, cancel culture, send them nasty messages, and to create opinion bubbles. In these sorts of groupthink communication, consensus becomes more important than reality, and suppressing dissent is very crucial. Everybody must think alike. In groups, usually there is a function called the mind guard, and that's a person who takes it upon him or herself to silence any kind of dissent. Groupthink is a very common phenomenon in human affairs, and it appeals to the tribal traditions of human communication. Such consensual group-based delusions, as we have seen, are common in history and common in many human groups. They tend to foster group identity and give people a sense of certainty and simplicity. They tend to be simple rather than complex or sophisticated explanations. Group thinking is fundamentally different from open, rational thinking and inconsistent with principles of free speech and respect for the truth. Absolutist thinking is by definition unhealthy because it misrepresents the true complexity and nature of reality. There are many examples of groups resisting information that might contradict or challenge their existing beliefs. We might describe it as protecting the tribal mind. This can happen by taking offense at somebody having an opinion that you don't agree with, virtue signaling, when individuals go out of their way to affirm the common beliefs of the particular group. Attempts at speech control occur sometimes when groups insist that anybody voicing an opinion they don't approve of should not be listened to and should be suppressed. Attempts to regulate language to change thinking in the direction of a particular accepted belief system is actually quite common even in modern society, where various groups seek to determine the kind of words, the kind of language you can use to express and communicate ideas. Part of the reason why sometimes simple, unreasonable beliefs dominate is that human beings are not terribly good in logical, rational, analytic thinking. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning social psychologist, argued that humans are endowed with two different information processing systems, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is a simple, heuristic, quick, effortless way of thinking when people rely on ready-made information, past experience, or knowledge they get from others. System 2 is effortful, slow, analytic, and systematic, and requires the careful inspection and evaluation of the actual evidence. A lot of human gullibility and group delusions occur because human beings are inclined to adopt System 1 thinking rather than System 2 thinking, taking the easy road out and accepting ready-made opinions rather than carefully evaluating the evidence. There are many examples of false beliefs today. Homeopathy, some people believe in crystals, some people believe in miracle cures, or Chinese medicine, none of which have any evidence to support them, but if you rely on System 1 thinking, this could become believable alternatives in a particular group or subculture. Another interesting example is that humans tend to see meaning in even meaningless information. If you click on the link on this slide, the Derek Chopra bullshit generator, this is an internet program that randomly puts together words to sound like wise sayings of Derek Chopra, the guru. Actually, the words are generated randomly by the computer. And what you will find is that however random the words, reading them, you will get the illusion that perhaps there is some deep meaning here that you might have missed. So the human brain is essentially evolved in such a way that we have an inclination to believe simplistic information and tend not to always employ analytical, systematic thinking to evaluate reality. Groups are capable of reinforcing and creating sometimes absurd belief systems. Conspiracy theories are a good example of that. These are essentially consensual group delusions which nowadays are reinforced by internet group bubbles where like-minded people share information with each other and so create an alternative reality. One of the best known conspiracy theories in recent times has been the QAnon conspiracy. This is a theory that argues that pedophiles drinking children's blood actually run the United States from a pizza restaurant in Washington, and this cult is led by Hillary Clinton. You might think this is a completely crazy set of ideas, but in fact, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people believe it and take it as the guiding light in their political perception. That kind of group-based influence in political movements can often take extreme forms and result in totalitarian political systems which embody extremes of group control. Similar things also occur in cults, religions, and sects, but it's basically totalitarian political movements and parties which represent these extremes of group control best. As I mentioned, fascism, Marxism, communism are all examples of that kind of tribal ideologies. Currently, the Chinese Communist Party is running concentration camps in order to change the views of oppressed minorities. The political consequences of totalitarian group control are very common. I actually personally had some experience with that. If you're interested, click and watch my personal story and my experiences with totalitarian political systems. The tendency to be influenced by groups and group ideologies is actually very important in everyday public life as well. Essentially, public ideals are informed by two conflicting sets of ideologies, individualist and collectivist ways of thinking. Individualism is the idea that all human beings are equal, we all belong to a single group, Homo sapiens, and our rights and obligations are the same for everybody. This is the model that was developed during the Enlightenment, and it embodies the liberal values of many Western civilizations. According to this view, we focus on universal human rights. We believe that all humans belong to a single group. When we seek justice for individuals, and most human rights laws embody these principles. However, there is also an alternative, a collectivist, more archaic vision of the human condition, which sees human beings as divided into different identity groups, and it seeks to determine rights and justice in terms of group identity. In contemporary public life, it's identity politics that embodies this view of the world, and it argues that when we seek justice and equality, we have to think about groups and not individuals. Focus on identity groups emphasizes the need to get justice for different groups rather than unique individuals. Ideologies such as multiculturalism or gender ideology emphasize the importance of the identity group to which an individual belongs. The source of these ideas can be found in collectivist ideologies, for example, Marxism, and the idea is that to improve the human condition, groups have to fight against other groups in order to achieve the justice and equality that they desire. The problem with collectivist ideologies is that the number of identity groups to which humans can belong is potentially unlimited. We all belong to many different groups, by sex, by race, by ethnicity, by religion, and so on. And if we're going to classify people into different groups, then necessarily we are using and affirming group stereotypes, which, as we know, can be potentially dangerous. By dividing people into different opposing groups, we are creating the possibility of group conflict. This is in direct contrast with the individualist approach, which emphasizes individual human rights. The basic individualist approach to human rights and increasing equality and justice in the world has been based on the assertion that all humans belong to one single group. We are all part of Homo sapiens. We all have the same rights, the same characteristics, and other people should be treated properly because they are part of the same group and not because they belong to a different group. A good example of that kind of universal humanist individualist approach is the Dalai Lama, who claims that our survival depends on our sense of the oneness of humanity. A very similar universal individualistic concept informed the human rights movement in the United States. Martin Luther King in the 1960s argued that tolerance should include color blindness. In other words, all human beings are the same and we should not be influenced by racial, ethnic, cultural, or religious characteristics. There is an alternative approach to improving tolerance and equality, which is based on classifying people into groups rather than treating them as individuals. This group conflict model assumes that each of us belongs to multiple groups in terms of our ethnicity, gender, religion, class, or age, and those groups which happen to occupy relatively less favored positions need to fight other groups to get a fair treatment. The group conflict model is essentially a reincarnation of the earlier Marxist class conflict model, but instead of predicting a conflict between different social classes, the idea now is that we mobilize cultural identity in order to bring about a more equal society. The real danger, though, with this ideology is that it's extremely easy to arise group hatred, group division between different segments of society. And if we encourage that kind of thinking, then social conflict may become unmanageable quite rapidly. What these examples illustrate is that by appealing to group differences, you run a very dangerous game of creating enmity, hatred, and potentially violence. Tribal thinking and populism, of course, are very common in human history and civilization. On the political right, fascism, nationalism, ethnocentrism, racism are all examples of tribal ideologies which result in the denigration of other groups. There are similar ideologies on the left. Marxism, identity politics, wokeism, cancel culture, political correctness are similarly designed to classify people into identity groups and then fight against those groups that are seen as oppressors or the reason for social injustice. These sorts of ideologies share interesting features. Close-mindedness, a sense of moral absolutism and righteousness, intolerance, and these are features which are totally in conflict with the traditional Enlightenment principles of rational and open debate, free exchange, and tolerance towards views and groups, even if you happen not to agree with them. Tribal thinking is increasingly common in modern political discourse. The partisan mind is characterized by a belief that your side is righteous and correct and that the other side is extremist and unacceptable. This sort of polarization has been well documented in political life, for example, in the United States. One study showed that partisan extremity is strongly related to reduced cognitive flexibility, both on the left and on the right of the political spectrum. In other words, the more convinced you are that your position is correct, the less flexible you become and the more simplistic your view of the world will turn out to be. The second study shows that partisans also overestimate the extremism of the other side on the political spectrum. If you adopt a tribal thinking, in a sense, you make the other side even more extreme, which is one way to prepare for battle. Liberal democracy, in contrast, is built on the exactly opposite assumption: the philosophy of freedom, the open exchange of ideas, and respect for the views of others, and respect for the possibility of exchanging information and benefiting from the information of the other side as well. Once a political culture becomes partisan and polarized, it becomes very much more difficult to reach any kind of pragmatic, reasonable consensus. Intolerance and tribal thinking, unfortunately, is also common on some university campuses. For example, in this study published in 2019, the researchers found that many students in Germany now actually favor restricting free speech, controlling what kind of opinions can be expressed on campus. There are powerful conformity pressures, and often if you don't like what somebody is saying, you take offense at divergent views and demand that those views should not be able to be voiced. It is interesting and somewhat surprising that left-leaning students seem to be less tolerant of free speech and more likely to demand suppressing views that they find unpalatable. Students on the right of the political spectrum in this study were found to be more likely to engage in self-censorship on issues to do with gender, immigration, or minorities. The tendency for universities to be hesitant about and insisting on free speech, and in many cases adopting speech codes and various restrictive practices, is of considerable concern, because unless there is a free exchange of opinions, as we have seen before, recognizing and understanding truth and reality will suffer. One common issue in contemporary public life is various attempts to protect the group mind by controlling language use. The use of speech codes, political correctness is manifest in some situations. Intolerance for alternative views can be quite common. As Roy Baumeister, a very famous social psychologist, said, attempts to suppress dissent is a clear sign that the dominant view is likely to be wrong. If you want to believe that your particular group ideas are correct, then the only way you can ascertain that is by listening to alternative views and arguing against them convincingly. Simply shutting up undesirable opinions is a very insufficient way of protecting the group mind. As we have seen, groups can have a very powerful influence in silencing dissenting opinions. In fact, philosophically, one of the foundational values of liberal democracy is the belief that everybody should be able to voice their opinions irrespective of whether it agrees or doesn't agree with the majority view or the group view. This philosophical position was put forward by John Stuart Mill. He argued that it's a foundational value of liberal democracy that we should never, under any circumstances, silence dissenting opinions. His argument briefly, if the dissenters are right, then we can only learn new information by listening to them. And if they turn out not to be right, then our views will be tested and potentially reinforced. So it's a very important value that free speech should never, under any circumstances, be constrained, even if some people find some of the messages they hear from others uncomfortable, unpleasant, or even potentially hurtful. Free speech is a universal and absolute value, without which open democracy cannot function. So, as we have seen, human beings are very strongly inclined to be influenced by the groups to which they belong, and we seem to be strongly predisposed to adopt group consensual ideas, sometimes delusions, even if they are incorrect, simply because they are the beliefs of the groups to which we belong to. In order to avoid that, it's important to emphasize the importance of viewpoint diversity or heterodoxy, the ability to listen to and pay attention to alternative, different views. Associating mainly with like-minded people is likely to make us more fallible and more likely to misrepresent truth. Our views must be tested against our sharpest critics if we want to truly believe them to be valid. So a better strategy is to cultivate viewpoint diversity. In arguing with people who take different views from your particular group, it's important to actually truly understand what the opposition is really saying. One strategy could be to restate your opponent's position to their satisfaction before making your own arguments. The link on these slides refers to a lecture by Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, who points out the dangers of intolerance and inability to listen to views which differ from your own. In this lecture, we discuss the importance of groups and group influences on human sociability. Fundamentally, humans owe their evolutionary success to their unique ability to organize themselves into cooperative groups, and this is really the secret of our survival and our success. As a consequence, human beings share a universal tendency of seeking group identity, group belonging, and group identification. Experiments in social psychology show that it takes very, very little for a person to feel affiliated with a group and act in a discriminatory manner against other groups. The universal human tendency for status and identity needs can easily be exploited. For example, consumerism is one of the symptoms of this. Humans seek signifying their belongingness to a particular group, and by making particular purchases, they can achieve this. Group identification is also easily exploited in political life. It's very easy to convince a person that their group identity is important, and that can easily result in intergroup conflict or even violence. Groupthink and the tendency to think like members of your groups can result in a misrepresentation of reality for the sake of believing what other people believe. For all of these reasons, it's very important to emphasize the importance of individuality, autonomy, tolerance, and rationality to counterbalance the fundamental need towards group belonging. And finally, again, on this slide and the following slides, you will see some recommendations for videos to look at on the internet, books to read, and generally find out more information about the sort of issues which we have covered in this lecture.